China is ignoring international calls to end its military exercises around Taiwan as it continues retaliation against last week's visit by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to the self-ruled island. Beijing's drills are disrupting international commerce and raising fears of confrontation. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Friday that China is overreacting to Speaker Pelosi's visit. China's Minister of Foreign Affairs responded today, calling the exercises, quote, open, transparent, and professional. Meantime, a ceasefire is holding today between Israel and Palestinian militants in Gaza following 3 days of violence. Israel had launched a strike on Friday against an Islamic commander to avert feared missile attacks. Iranian-backed militants still responded with hundreds of rockets, most of which were intercepted by Israel's air defenses. More than 40 Palestinians were killed over the weekend, some by misfired devices. There were no reports of Israeli deaths or injuries. Joining us now to discuss is James Carafano, Vice President of Foreign Policy and National Security at the Heritage Foundation. James, welcome. Great to be with you. I want to first off talk more about China's military drills. President Biden says that he's concerned about China's movement, although he does not think that it'll go further than the drills. Meanwhile, Taiwan says the drills over the weekend appeared to simulate an attack. Your thoughts, and where do you see this all going?
Well, look, I think if China was going to attack, rather than do just a bunch of demonstrations, they would have attacked. So I think there's real question whether they're at the point where they have the willingness or the capability to conduct offensive operations against Taiwan. But one, make no mistake that China wants to regain Taiwan. And they prefer to do it through like the Hong Kong model, where they got a friendly government that would just kind of collapse and do what they want and then just absorb them in like the blob. But if it comes to force one day, I think they would do that. But we don't think that day is today. So here's my problem with kind of the U.S. response to that. For Blinken to say the Chinese are overreacting, well, this is a nonsense. He's basically finger waving at the Chinese, like they just don't understand it. Why are they being so petulant? They sense weakness in the U.S., and they're not moving this to prep for an invasion, perhaps, but they're using this to take advantage of what they see really as a feckless U.S. government that doesn't want to hold them accountable and doesn't want to stand up to them, and they're kind of making what they can out of it. So for the U.S. essentially to aid them by essentially pretend like, well, we just need to lower the temperature here, I think is ridiculous. It's just encouraging more aggressive behavior from China.
Yeah, and as you know, China also announced it's halting talks with the U.S. in a number of areas, such as anti-drug efforts, climate change, and also military issues. And the Communist government also sanctioned Nancy Pelosi in response to the Speaker's visit to Taiwan. So, you know, what is all this signal? And also, what do you think our response should be?
Well, first of all, the fact that these talks ended as some kind of punishment for the United States really shows how ridiculous our administration is by engaging in these talks to begin with. China's building a coal-fired power plant every day. So the notion that somehow they're really going to engage with us in talks about climate change, this is laughable. This is the John Kerry fantasy. And on drugs, this country has people dying from opioid at record rates. And the reason why these opioids are here because the cartels in Mexico and Latin America are getting them for almost for nothing from Chinese criminal organizations, and you know the government knows that. So the Chinese government is aiding and abetting the drug invasion of the United States and stopping cooperation on discussions on anti-drug thing is a thing. So this is nonsense. I mean, and the mill-to-mill contacts, military-to-military discussions, that has never been about actually discussing things. This is the Chinese military showing up, vacuuming what they can from the U.S. side, and then giving us the Chinese party line from the other side. These things were all Potemkin villages. They were nonsense of pretend cooperation. And so for the Chinese think they're taking it away and treating this like a punishment, and for the U.S. government just to be saying, you know what, let's just not do them at all forever, which ought to be the U.S. response, it just shows that our government is really just wants this whole thing to go away. They think they can work with the Chinese, and they just want everybody to calm down. And they don't get it, that the more they do that, the more they enrage and empower the Chinese to be more aggressive.
Yeah, before I let you go, I want to pivot to the Middle East. As you mentioned, Israel and Palestinian, the Palestinian militants called a ceasefire after nearly 3 days of violence. James, what more do you know about this? I understand it was the most violence clash since the 11-day war between Israel and Hamas.
Look, I'm not in the Hamas, brain trust there, so I don't know what's going on. Of all the analysis I've heard, the one to me that seems to connect the dots the most, but who knows if it's really true, is the fact that, look, you had an Israeli government fall. The Iranians have been poking around in the region. Could the Iranians have gone to these guys and say, now's the time to kind of embarrass this Israeli government and test it because we have a stakeholder, a caretaker government, and so maybe the Iranians were testing the Israelis. And the thing about Israel is it really doesn't matter if you have a caretaker government or a strong government or a liberal government. They're going to act in the defense of Israel, and they're going to respond forcefully to provocations, which they did. And the other thing which is very, very clear is not only did the Israeli government respond forcefully to attacks on the Israeli people, they do it in a structured, in a disciplined, in a moral, and a way in which they are focusing on legitimate targets of people trying to kill Israelis and not indiscriminately going after people in Gaza or the other areas.
Well, Jim, so much more we can talk about, but we're out of time. Thank you so much for coming on. Always appreciate your insights.
Thanks for having me.